Okay, so let's start then. So welcome everyone. With this lecture we start the second part of the course on consciousness, cognition and rationality. As you know, it is an interdisciplinary course taught by different professors, mostly coming from the free will and consciousness research team. So, well, I'm Giacomo Andreoletti, most of you know me already, and I teach philosophy here at SAS. And in this course I will be with you for 2 weeks for a total of 4 lectures and 2 seminars to talk mostly, in my case, about consciousness. Okay, we'll have little to say about cognition and rationality. We'll mostly talk about consciousness. So, the title of today's lecture is like the art and the easy problem of consciousness. So that's what we will be trying to understand tonight. Here is a little bit of overview of what I'm talking about tonight. We'll start from a general introduction about consciousness from a philosophical perspective. Then we will talk about 2 different concepts of mind, the so-called phenomenal and the psychological aspects of mind. We will explain what those 2 things mean. Then we will move to the double life of mental terms, of like the kind of vocabulary that we use to describe mental activities. And then the main part, we will talk about the 2 mind-body problems, the easy and the hard ones. And then finally, we will see how this reflects into like 2 different understanding of consciousness, which is our main topic for tonight. Now, what can we say about consciousness? It's funny that when this course was advertised on Facebook, someone in the comments wrote, "Please define consciousness." I think like kind of implying that either we don't know how to, the teachers teaching this course don't know how to define consciousness, or maybe that it's just impossible to define consciousness. I don't know if this person is here or he or she was just a random person on the internet. Anyway, it turns out that it's actually really difficult to define consciousness, if not impossible, for sure at least extremely difficult. And one of the goals of tonight's lecture is that to try to have at least, maybe not a definition, but at least a better understanding of what we mean by consciousness. If we want to study consciousness, let's at least try to understand how we understand this concept. Now, on the one hand, consciousness is something very familiar to us. I assume that everyone in this room, even though I cannot be completely certain, is conscious, okay? Each and every one of us is having a conscious experience while they're listening and attending this lecture. And I am conscious as well. So that's why it is familiar. We are familiar with this idea of being conscious simply because, well, we are conscious most of the time, at least. But at the same time, actually, since the beginning of human thought, from ancient philosophy to nowadays, consciousness arguably remains a mystery. It's a mystery why, at least human beings, maybe some other animals, are conscious. Why consciousness exists in the very first place. We are sure that it exists because we experience it all the time. But it's unclear, it's said to be a mystery because we still don't know, arguably, this can be debatable, why it exists, why the natural physical world gives rise to consciousness. And the second big mystery is like how consciousness can arise from the physical world. Okay? Arguably, consciousness arises from the brain, which is a physical thing. Our brains are made of particles and in general physical matters. How can this, why the particular arrangement of the physical stuff in my brain generates consciousness, whereas the physical arrangement in my laptop, for instance, does not generate consciousness, arguably, right? Now, in here, we have a quote that is reported in the book by Chalmers, the Chalmers that we are reading. And it's interesting, it comes from the International Dictionary of Psychology, and this quote is quite illuminating. And they're trying to define consciousness, obviously, in the dictionary. So I'm going to read it. Consciousness, the having of perceptions, thoughts, and feelings. Awareness. The term is impossible to define, they say, except in terms that are unintelligible without a grasp of what consciousness means. So basically, Sutherland is saying, it's impossible to define what consciousness is. You can only define with words that presuppose that you already know what consciousness is. So it will not be a definition. And I continue. Many fall into the trap of confusing consciousness with self-consciousness. To be conscious, it is only necessary to be aware of the external world. Consciousness is a fascinating but elusive phenomenon. It is impossible to specify what it is, what it does, or why it evolved. Nothing worth reading has been written about it. So we are reading about consciousness in this course, so maybe it's not worth it. I don't know. We'll figure it out. Anyway, but this is just to show that even from a prestigious source, consciousness is considered to be a mystery in many disciplines, not only in philosophy. It is hard to define, if not impossible, and it's also difficult to understand what it means, like, to say that someone is conscious. Now, before I continue, I have a big disclaimer. So we're facing a difficult topic, something that, for instance, is impossible to define, and has puzzled many people in many disciplines. And I'm supposed to be here to explain you what consciousness is. And so that's why I wanted to put a big disclaimer. First of all, I just want to say, for the sake of clarity, that I'm not a big expert in this topic. I mean, some of you might know that I mostly work in metaphysics, whereas the problem of consciousness in philosophy is mostly addressed from within the so-called branch of philosophy, philosophy of mind. So I'm not an expert in philosophy of mind. Of course, I read something, of course, I prepared for this course. But I just wanted to put this disclaimer to say that, yeah, I'm not a big expert. If you will have challenging questions, maybe I will not be able to answer them. And the topic itself is very challenging. So I took this as also as an exercise for me to learn new things for you. And I will try to keep things to, let's say, the most basic concepts that, that can be relevant for all of us about consciousness from a philosophical perspective. And also, I will rely heavily on this book by Chalmers, the one that is in our syllabus for our students. I will heavily rely on it, again, because, well, I'm not an expert, I read several things, but I can't claim to be a super expert, so I will mostly follow this book by David Chalmers, The Conscious Mind, and we will try to read it together, discuss it together, and understand it together. So, I decided to use this textbook by David Chalmers. Why? Well, David Chalmers, who by the way is this guy, is the so-called, he's like a very important, if not one of the most important philosophers nowadays. He works at New York University and is mostly famous for his several works on consciousness. Yeah, I chose this book because it's one of the most seminal works, at least in the philosophical tradition, in the contemporary tradition, obviously, that tackle the problem of consciousness. I think it contains very controversial claims, but as it always happens in philosophy, hopefully it will be thought-provoking for us to better understand the problem of consciousness. Okay, so we'll be with Chalmers, at least for tonight lectures. Now, so our initial attempt might be, it usually works like that. If you want to tackle a problem, sometimes it's good to start with definitions and try to understand what we're talking about, right? And given that we're supposed to talk about consciousness, let's see if and how we can define consciousness. Now, Chalmers, I think this part is very interesting by him, this part in the book by Chalmers. Like, he observes that usually when we provide a definition, when we provide a good definition of a term or of a concept, we do so by using other terms. Okay? If I want to define something, I define it in terms of something else. Example, like in the slides. If someone does not know what a function is in mathematics, I can give them a definition of what a function is. Okay? And this is just a standard definition. Like a function is a binary relation between two sets that associates each element of the first set to exactly one element of the second set. Okay, this is a definition that works. Why it works? Well, because we are defining the term function in terms of other words or concepts. Okay? So if someone does not know what a function is, but if she knows what a binary relation is, what a set is, and what it means to associate a member of the set to a member of the other set, he or she, through the definition, will be able to understand what a function is. Okay? So the point is that a good definition defines a concept in terms of other, more primitive concepts. Okay? So I define a function, for instance, in terms of the concept of a set and members of a set. And things work. Okay? It can be maybe difficult, but if you struggle with mathematics, but it's a perfectly good definition. This is so because good definition need to avoid so-called circularity. Okay, a standard example of circularity, someone asked me, like, Giacomo, what is a function? And they tell them, well, you know, a function is a function. And this definition is not going to help. It's true that a function is a function, but it's not going to be informative. Right? If I give this definition, because I'm defining the concept of function by using the very concept that I want to define. And it's not going to work. Again, if someone does not know what a function is, my definition is not going to be illuminating. Always good definitions need to define a term in terms of other terms which are more primitive. Okay? Now, so what can we do with consciousness? According to Chalmers, we cannot use this strategy. We cannot define consciousness in terms of more basic and fundamental concepts, let's say. It's simply impossible because consciousness itself, it says, is a fundamental concept. And it was an idea that was also like resonating in the quote that we just read. We simply cannot define consciousness, or at least according to Chalmers, in terms of more fundamental concepts. So what we are left with is to try to characterize the concept or the idea of consciousness. Now, characterizing something does not mean defining it. Again, we saw what a definition is. A characterization typically is something different. We can, for instance, point to something and say, like, look, that is consciousness. And this, again, is not a definition. Or we can point to some phenomena which are in the vicinity of the thing we want to define, so that we can clarify to our audience what we mean by consciousness. But again, these are not definitions, only characterization. Or we can provide examples, like, for instance, this is a conscious state, this other state is not a conscious state. So the best we can do is, like, sorry for this person who commented on Facebook, at least according to Chalmers, we cannot define consciousness. At best, we can give a characterization to understand what we're talking about. And let's try to give a characterization of it, again, with Chalmers. When we talk about consciousness, we are mostly talking about experience, about the experiences that all of us internally have. Okay? Like right now, I have an experience of seeing you in front of me, hearing my voice, and so on and so on, my internal feelings, and so on and so on. So consciousness has to do, as a first approximation to characterization, with the experiences that we have. A second thing that has to do with consciousness is that it is somewhat subjective. I told you, I assume that each of us is conscious, and this consciousness is always a subjective experience, as opposed obviously to objective, like, I don't know, objective events, physical events that happen in the world. This fact that we are conscious from a first person perspective is something that relates only to the subject. Think about the fact that no one, for instance, can access your conscious experience. It's just impossible. I have access to my conscious experience somehow. I cannot access your conscious experience, vice versa. So there is an element of subjectivity. So think about things like the emotions that we might have, or desires, or like thinking about a particular thought. All of them are accompanied always by a certain feeling, by a certain experience, which again is subjective. There is this famous expression in philosophy of mind, which is due to the philosopher Nagel, that says that consciousness is this what it is like to feel something. And again, it's definitely not a definition. Notice, it's just we're pointing to what consciousness is. The idea is that when we experience something, let's say, when I look at a painting and I have certain emotions and I have certain thoughts, for instance, there is a certain what it feels like to have an experience of that particular painting. Think about when you're listening to a song. This comes with all sorts of auditory experiences and emotions as well, and there is a particular what it feels like to have this experience of listening to a song. So it's a particular quality of the subjective experience. That's what we mean when we talk about mental experiences which are conscious. And sometimes you will see in the book and in the literature, they're called these subjective, what it feels like to experience something, are sometimes called qualia. That's a technical term that refers to this idea of phenomenal subjective experience, or also sometimes simply phenomenal qualities. Okay? Now, try to look at this blue square on the slides. The idea is that, okay, we are experiencing a perception of something, in this case just a particular, just simple blue square. I hope it's a square, it might be a rectangle, but you get the idea. That is that if you look at it, you have an conscious experience of blueness. Okay? You are experiencing the color blue. So, I continue with this experience. The idea is that the experience that you just had is different from the experience that you're having now when you're looking at this green square. Before you were experiencing blueness, and now you're experiencing greenness, as philosophers say. And those two very simple, yet different, two simple experiences are supposed to be different, and they look different to us, if you like, and look at your own conscious experience. In terms of what it feels like, I don't know, it feels different to look at a blue color than looking at a green color. Those two experiences have different phenomenal qualities, have different qualia, as philosophers will say. The subjective experience we have when looking at those two are different in character, they are not the same experience. Or think about just more complex examples. Think about the experience that you have when you look at a particular painting that maybe you like and brings back memories or thoughts or whatever you have. Okay? There is again a particular experience which is hard to define and characterize, but from a subjective viewpoint we know that it is there. We know that, I don't know, if I look at a certain painting I have a certain experience, and if I look at another painting, I will have another subjective experience. So, again, we didn't give a definition. We tried to give a characterization following Chalmers of what we mean or what we're trying to investigate when we talk about consciousness. This idea of what it feels like in our subjective experience to have an experience. Now, why is it a mystery, or one of the reasons why this is a mystery? Now, first of all, it's very natural to think that consciousness, the fact that we are conscious, must be a natural phenomenon. Why? Well, I don't know, because we do not tend to believe in magical things. I don't know, maybe the fact that we are conscious is a magical thing, I don't know. But, I mean, our default setting is to think that everything that happens in our universe is somehow natural. It comes from nature, and therefore it should be explainable and perhaps even understandable by us, because, well, we understood a lot about nature so far, even though there are things we still don't. And Chalmers talks about this surprise principle, as he calls it. Okay? And I will just read the quote. If all we knew about were the facts of physics, and even the facts about dynamics and information processing in complex systems, then the existence of conscious experience will come as a surprise to us. The idea is that it seems to be still a surprise that even if we knew everything there was to know, let's say, about our brains, about what happens in the physics of our brain, it's still a little bit surprising that this universe contains consciousness, okay? It's still asking for an explanation, the fact that my physical brain, which is, I don't know, just made by neurons and a deeper level by atoms and quarks or whatever, but in any case by matter, how these can give rise to these subjective conscious experiences that we have. At the same time, we are sure that conscious experience exists because we experience it ourselves, but how does it arise? Why the universe features this concept, this conscious experience, okay? So Chalmers observes like we have at least two things that need to be explained. Okay, there is a first explanandum. Explanandum means when the thing that you want to explain, which is based on several, well, on three questions, like why does consciousness exist in the first place? Okay, we can imagine a world where consciousness does not exist, for instance, only other natural phenomena. How does it arise from the physical world? Why the physical world, like for instance our brain or maybe our body, generate consciousness? And also questions such as how widespread it is. Okay? We can assume that human beings are consciousness. What about dogs and cats? I don't know, other animals? What about my laptop? Is it conscious or not? Where does consciousness end? We can ask these sorts of questions, and that's part of the first explanandum, the first thing that we want to explain. A second different set of questions, is like, why, when we have a conscious experience, like a specific one, it has the character that it has? Okay, we looked at the example of the blue square. Why, when I look at the blue square, I have a certain subjective experience? Why is it exactly that experience as opposed to any other experience? Why, when I look at this blue square, I don't have the experience that I have when I look at the green square? So, why the experiences, why we have the kind of experiences that we have, okay? Of course, we can tell a story about, for instance, how light is reflected in the physical world, how it is perceived by our eyes, how the information goes from the retina to my brain and so on. We know a lot about this. But Chalmers argues that there is a further question, which is like, okay, why these things happening, for instance, in my brain when I perceive a blue square, generate this, what it feels like to feel blue, okay? Or as he puts it, why the perception of a blue square is accompanied by that specific experience that we have instead of other ones, okay? Now, here we're just at the outset, but the idea is that if we want a good theory of consciousness, it should tackle both explananda, okay? It should explain why consciousness exists, how it generates from the physical world, and also to explain why every time we have a conscious experience, we have that particular conscious experience instead of possible other ones. Okay, that's what a good theory of consciousness should do, to be a good theory of consciousness. Now, further clarifications about the terminology. As a matter of fact, and this generates a lot of confusion in the debate, we actually kind of use the word consciousness, let's say in everyday life, but even in scientific practice, the word consciousness for really different things, which are not necessarily the same thing. Okay, we can talk of being conscious as a synonym of being awake as opposed to being asleep. Sometimes people can talk of, is said to be conscious if he or she is able to exercise some control over their actions. Okay, so they don't just, behave randomly, but, well, they're conscious, we say, because they're kind of able to exercise control on what they do. Okay. Some people, we might use the word conscious or consciousness to refer to actions or behavior which is controlled internally. Okay? Or sometimes we can also use the word consciousness to be like when we say, for instance, oh, I'm conscious that there is this problem. Okay? To express the idea that we are conscious that something is going on. Okay? Or I can say I'm conscious of my internal desires. Okay? In this case, it's a case of introspection. So, as a matter of fact, we use the word consciousness or conscious to refer to very different things. And this, as I was saying, does not help in the debate about consciousness. So, just to be precise, or to try to be precise, at least in these 4 lectures, we will follow Chalmers in saying, and quote, when I talk about consciousness, I'm talking only about the subjective quality of experience, what it is like to be a cognitive agent. Okay? So, for the remainder of our lectures, we will try to use the word consciousness only for this. Okay? To refer to this kind of subjective experience, subjective character that accompanies our experiences. Okay? When I'm looking at the blue square, I have a certain subjective experience. To me, that is something that it feels like to look at blueness, and that's what consciousness is, at least in our simulation. Okay? It's a simulation, obviously. Other people might want to characterize consciousness differently, and the debate will go on forever, but for our purposes, we will follow our simulation. Consciousness is what it feels like to be in a certain mental state or to be a cognitive agent. Now, and the kind of conscious experiences that we can have are many, okay? Here we'll just mention some of them. All the sorts of visual, look at something, auditory experiences, when, for instance, think about listening to music, tactile experience, taste experiences, and so on. All of them are accompanied by a certain what it feels like. Think about when you eat, some dish that you really like. It is accompanied by a conscious experience. That particular phenomenal character in your mind is different from any other phenomenal experience that you have when you eat something else. Experiences of being hot or cold, pain is like the experience of feeling pain. It's a classical example in philosophy of mind and beyond. Emotions, desires, feelings, conscious thoughts that we might have, and also, finally, the sense of unity that we have. I mean, we perceive ourselves as one individual that has many conscious experiences that varies, of course, that vary throughout time, but they are all somehow unified by the fact that it is the same subject that experiences them. Now, why are we looking at philosophy to, one might wonder, right, in addressing consciousness? Because one might say, well, nowadays we have cognitive science, other scientific disciplines like neurophysiology and the like, that they all tackle the problem of consciousness. Now, the idea of Chalmers and others is that, of course, these other sciences should be taken seriously in where they tell us about our brain, consciousness, and so on. But still, there is a role for philosophy to play, at least in trying to understand what the problem is, what the problem of consciousness is, how it can be solved by science and philosophy, and what the problem itself amounts to, which will be the main topic of tonight's class. Okay. Now, a distinction that is crucial for the remainder of our series of lectures is the so-called distinction between the psychological concept of mind and the phenomenal concept of mind. We will see some examples, but to start, the psychological concept of mind has to do with what our mental states, and by mental states we mean things like desires, beliefs, knowledge, thoughts that we might have, introspection, and so on. So the psychological aspect of mind has to do with what these mental states do, okay? Or what these mental states cause, okay? There is a causal understanding when we talk about the psychological concepts of mind, okay? We'll look at some examples to clarify. And then there is a second aspect that Chalmers calls the phenomenal concept of mind, which is, again, what we were trying to describe with a certain difficulty because it's hard to find the right words. It is how it subjectively feels to us to have certain experiences. This is the phenomenal second concept of mind. So as I said, the first one works at the level of what the mind does. Our minds do stuff, okay? Whereas the second one has to do with how it feels like to have a certain experience. So, two different concepts, like what the mind does versus what it feels like to have certain experiences. Again, a quote that I find quite illuminating to illustrate this distinction. What it means for a state to be phenomenal, for a mental state to be phenomenal, is for it to feel a certain way. Okay? The fact that when I look at the blue square, it feels a certain way to me, which is different from the way it feels to me when I look at the green square. Whereas what it means for a state to be psychological is for it to play an appropriate causal role, okay? To cause something to happen or to be caused by other things. These distinct notions should not be conflated, at least at the outset, okay? Maybe it will turn out to be the case that the psychological and the phenomenal concept of the mind are the same, but at least as in the first approximation, we should bear in mind that the two concepts are not distinct. Are distinct. Okay, one has to do with, again, what the mind does. The other one has to do with what it feels like to have certain experiences. Okay, so let's see an example of the first kind, a psychological state. Take the case of learning. Okay, suppose that, I don't know, take the mental state that after you studied a lot, you learned something, so you end up in a mental state where you can say, well, my mind has learned something. Okay? Now, we can characterize learning as a disposition that someone acquires to behave in a certain way in presence of certain stimulations. Okay, let's use an example. Someone learns how to solve linear equations. Okay, well, what does it mean that this person has learned to solve linear equations? Well, it means that his or her behavior changed. Now, if you present this person with a linear equation, he or she will be able to solve it. Okay, her behavior changed after learning in such a way that now he or she is able to perform certain things in the correct way, okay? To respond appropriately to certain external stimulation, like for instance, presenting this person with a linear equation. Now, notice that there is a causal, if we describe learning in this way, just as a predisposition to behave in a certain way, there is a causal flavor to it. Because if my mind has learned something, now it is able, my mind is able to respond appropriately to certain stimulation that causes, for instance, me to solve the equation in a correct way. So, in this psychological understanding of the mind, learning falls into this category. It is a causal concept, and it has to do with something that my mind can do. For instance, it can solve linear equations. Okay? So this just to illustrate the first aspect of the mind, the psychological, as Chalmers calls it, which has to do with what the mind does, and it has to do with causation. What causes mental state, and what is caused by mental states. Notice, you might have noticed that it's a bit maybe strange to use the word psychological or psychology in this context. It's again a stipulation. You shouldn't think of like in this context as as referring to the field of psychology as we know it today. It's just that, for lack of a better word, it was decided to use the word psychological, but only in this strict sense, at least in this context, of understanding the concept of mind, of mental states as doing something and having this causal flavor. Okay, so it departs from like our ordinary usage of the word psychological. Okay. Now, in philosophy of mind, if you look at the history of it, definitely historically the most important figure traditionally is Descartes. I mean, for sure that SES students study in great books, and you might remember like pages about the mind-body problem. There is this interesting passage, I will read just the first part, as to the fact that this is Descartes in the Meditations on First Philosophy, as to the fact that there can be nothing in the mind insofar as it is a thinking thing, of which it is not aware. This seems to be self-evident. For there is nothing that we can understand to be in the mind that is not a thought or dependent on a thought. So Descartes famously believed that everything which, let's say, happens in our minds, thoughts, ideas, feelings, and emotions, and so on, we are necessarily aware of them. Okay, something, as he said, the mind is sort of transparent in the sense that if something happens in our minds, we're automatically aware of it. If I have a desire, it must be the case that I'm also aware of having this desire. Now, we know from modern psychology, from the work on Freud and others, that this is not, we found out that this is not the case. We talk of unconscious desires, for instance, unconscious thoughts, and so on. It means that it's perfectly possible that for our minds to have desires of which we are not aware, okay, on a conscious level. And notice that again here we are, and notice these unconscious desires that, for instance, we might have, they still play a causal role. Okay, we can, for instance, explain the behavior of someone. I don't know. I'm not an expert in psychology either, but you can explain. I don't know. This person behaved in a certain way because he had an unconscious desire to damage this other person. Maybe this person was not aware of the desire to damage this other person, but still this desire played a causal role and caused a certain behavior. Okay? Now, so the idea is that when we talk about the psychological aspects of the mind, we're talking about what the mind does or what certain mental states can cause. Okay, like in the example, the desire to cause damage or harm to someone else explains or causes the actions and the behavior of the person. So there is this kind of causal flavor in the psychological understanding of the mind. Now, if you look at philosophy and beyond, there have been like many accounts of the mind that fall into this category that Chalmers called psychological. Okay, so according, for instance, to the so-called school of logical behaviorism, mental states are exactly defined in terms of the behavior that they cause. Okay, so for instance, what does it mean to believe that it's gonna rain tonight? For instance, suppose that I have this belief. I'm in the mental state of believing that tonight is going to rain. Well, to have this belief, this school of thought says, is just for my mind to cause an appropriate behavior. For instance, the fact that I will take my umbrella when I go out, or that I will take a taxi to go home because I don't want to walk in the rain. So, some school of thought like just define what it is for something to be a mental state in terms of the things, especially behavior, that these can cause. Okay? So it's again a psychological understanding of the mind. According to others, in particular philosophers David Lewis and David Armstrong, and it's so-called the functionist account of the mind, we still have this causal understanding of what it is for something to be a mental state. The idea is that, according to this account, a mental state, again, take my belief that it's going to rain, is something that tends to be produced by certain stimuli, okay? For instance, the fact that I look at the weather forecast and it says that it's going to rain. And so it is caused by something and tends to cause a certain behavior, okay? The fact that I will take my umbrella and so on. The difference here is that also, the account is a bit more defined, because what is taken into account is also that, of course, all different mental states may have causal influences with other mental states. I don't know, my belief that tonight is going to rain is going to interact, for instance, with my desire to, get home without getting soaked, for instance, okay? But again, what we need to stress here is that this is an understanding of the mind, of the conscious mind, in terms of what the mind does. It is caused by certain things, and in turn causes certain other things, like behavior. And for instance, this this functionist interpretation of the mind tends to explain everything that happens in the mind in terms of the psychological aspects, in terms of causality, in terms of what causes mental states and what is caused by mental states. They say, look, that's all there is to our mental life. It's just that there are mental states. Those are defined by the things that they're typically caused by, and by the things that they typically cause. Okay. And this is a criticism of Chalmers, is that if you follow this account as a full, comprehensive account of the mind, you are leaving something out. Okay? You can, of course, explain a lot in terms of causes and effects, in terms of explaining what the mind does, but what you will leave out, if you think that this explanation is comprehensive, and the last explanation, so to say, is again this subjective field, this character, this phenomenal character that accompanies all our experiences, okay? This qualia, if you want to use this technical term, okay? So the idea again is that if we provide an explanation of the mind only in causal terms, or only with terms of psychological aspects, we leave out this phenomenal character of the mind, what it feels like to have experiences, which we know is part of our conscious experience just because we experience it all the time, okay? So a first conclusion to draw is that these two aspects of our mental lives are separated, are different and distinct. One again has to do with causality, what our mind does, what our mind can do, the fact that, for instance, it can learn, or it can introspect itself, or it can control itself, and so on. And the second aspect is the phenomenal aspect, which is what it feels like to have certain experiences. Okay. Now, one of the main points of Chalmers is that the psychological aspects of the mind are rather easy to explain. Not easy in the sense that, just without thinking about it, without putting it into any effort, you will be able to explain, for instance, why our mind is able to learn. But he says that, well, in principle, there is no metaphysical mystery. We can science can come up with explanations of how a particular physical system, for instance, can learn something. Maybe it will take time, maybe it will take a lot of resources and so on to come up with a full explanation. But there is no mystery, he says, in explaining how a particular system can do something, and the stress is on do. Okay? What is mysterious is why these mental lives that we have are always accompanied by certain phenomenal subjective experiences. This is the mysterious part of the problem of consciousness. Why, again, when I'm learning something, there is a particular what it feels like to learn something. I don't know, to learn how to solve linear equations has a particular feeling which is different from, learning how to, write in Latin, for instance, okay? Now, the psychological, in this particular sense, remember that we're using the word psychological in a kind of stipulative way, and the phenomenal aspects of the mind arguably exhaust all there is to the mental life, in the sense that, okay, our minds do stuff, they're caused by stuff, they in turn cause things to happen, and also there is always, the experiences we have are accompanied by this phenomenal character, and these arguably exhaust all there is to our mental lives. Now, when we talk about specific things that our minds, so to say, experience, what happens as a matter of fact is that the phenomenal and the psychological aspects of mental states go together, okay? In the sense that a mental state can be partly a phenomenal mental state and a psychological mental state. Sometimes a mental state can only be psychological, sometimes it can be only phenomenal, but most of the time the two things happen together at least, okay? And this, of course, does not help our understanding of what's going on, but still, we try. Let's look at some examples, okay? Think about the experience of feeling pain, okay? Now, there is so your mind, for instance, is experiencing pain. There is a psychological aspect to it. Remember, the psychological aspect has to do with causation and what the mind does. For instance, one can say that pain is caused, the mental state of pain is caused by certain things happening in your body, which are then transmitted to your brain, and so on. One can, of course, have all sorts of nuanced explanations that, I'm not aware of, but of course we know that there are physical explanations of how pain works, how, for instance, it is transmitted to our brain, and so on. And then one can say that, for instance, the mental state of pain causes some things to happen. If I'm feeling pain because I'm touching a hot surface, this mental state of pain will cause that, I don't know, my body retracts my hand, okay, to not feel pain anymore. So that is that we can describe the mental state of pain in psychological terms by saying what causes these mental states, and again, can be physical harm, for instance, and by telling a story about what this mental state causes, for instance, the fact that I retract my hand to just like stop feeling pain. So we can describe the mental state of pain, for instance, in psychological terms, by telling a story about what causes it, by maybe, telling a physical story of like how pain, is, what happens in our brain when we experience pain and so on and so forth, and by explaining the causes that underlie this process. And that's a psychological aspect. But notice that when we experience pain, there's also a phenomenal component to it. And by phenomenal, we're talking about the phenomenal aspects of the mind. There is something that it feels like to have a particular pain, okay? And for instance, back pain is different from, having a headache, okay? The two experiences feel different to us, okay? What it feels like to have back pain, this particular phenomenal character is different from what it feels like to have a headache, okay? And this second thing is the so-called phenomenal aspect of the mind. So for instance, the point is the concept of the mental state of pain as a psychological component and also a phenomenal component. To convince you that those two things, the psychological and the phenomenal components, are different, notice that we can perfectly conceive or imagine a system that has the former, the psychological one, but not the phenomenal one. Okay? We can, for instance, build a system that, a sort of machine that behaves like us when it's subject to a pain experience. Okay? That, for instance, moves away if there are certain stimulations and so on. So we can build a system that behaves causally in the right way to pain stimulations, but we can imagine at least that this system, all these experiences of pain, these mental states, are not accompanied by the feeling that we perceive, that we feel in our subjective experience when we have pain. Okay? Again, imagine a machine that behaves like us when it comes to like painful interactions, but there's no subjective experience of feeling pain. Okay? Perception leads a double life as well. And we perceive something, there is a psychological aspect to it and also a phenomenal aspect to it. The psychological aspect can be described in causal terms. One can tell a nuanced and refined story about what happens in terms of causality when we perceive something. Again, the light reaches our retina, the message is transmitted to the brain and so on. The various parts of the image are connected together by the brain into a single mental image and so on. And of course, this story, we know a lot about this, and this story can be refined, but in principle, notice that it is always a causal history about what happens in terms of causes and what perception causes. That is the psychological aspect of the mind. But then, when we have a visual experience, when we perceive something, as said, this is almost always accompanied by this elusive, what it feels like to have a certain experience, okay? What it feels, this phenomenal character that sometimes is also called sensation. This idea that the experience I have when I see blueness is different from seeing greenness. Now, the phenomenal and the psychological aspects are often mixed, okay? If we do not pay attention, it's like really natural to mix them or conflate them. One of the reasons why we confuse them is that they naturally tend to co-occur, okay? Like think about, for instance, the case of pain. Well, it is the case that when I have a phenomenal experience of pain, it's because I have a psychological experience of pain, right? It's because some causal processes are going on in my body and then in my mind. And at the same time, I also have a phenomenal experience of pain. So the fact that they always, or almost always, tend to happen together is not going to help us in terms of understanding, but still we should make an effort in keeping those two concepts, the psychological and the phenomenal one, separated. Okay. There is Chalmers, or actually, given that we're in the middle of it, let me ask, or maybe no, I will ask at the end if there are any questions. Now, according to Chalmers, there is a question which is revelatory when we want to find out whether a mental state is primarily a psychological mental state or a phenomenal one. And the question is the following. Could something be an instance of the mental state M without any associated phenomenal quality? If yes, it is primarily a psychological state. If not, it's probably a mix of the two. Okay, we'll use an example on how this test can be run. Okay? So the question was, could something be an instance of mental state M without any associated phenomenal quality? Take the case of learning that we already discussed. Okay? Like the mental state when someone has learned something. Okay? We said that learning can be described as a sort of adaptation, right? I learn something when I adapt my behavior to respond in a certain way. Okay? I learn how to solve linear equations because when one presents me with a linear equation, I know what to do. Okay? I change my behavior in a way that is appropriate to solve linear equations. Now the question is, can we have instances of learning that can be not accompanied by these phenomenal experiences, what it feels like? Arguably the answer is yes. Why? Well, because nowadays, for instance, we have so-called, for instance, machine learning. We have computers or softwares that can learn, okay? I don't know. If you think about what happens, for instance, with computer softwares that, the most advanced softwares that can, for instance, learn how to play the game of chess, what happens is that you feed the computer with the rules of the game, like how the pieces move and all the other rules of the game. But then what happens is that the computer, the software, learns by itself. Basically, once you give the rules to the software runs like, I don't know, millions of games and learns by itself. So no one instructs the computer on how to play chess effectively. It's just that by the millions of trials and errors, the computer learns how to play chess, for instance. But arguably the computer of the software doing this learning process, notice that it is learning because the software adapts its behavior to circumstances and external simulations, okay? Now, at the end of the learning process, the software knows to behave if it has to play a game, right? So this is definitely learning, but it's at least likely that when the computer or the software learns how to play chess, for instance, this experience of learning is not accompanied by any of what we're calling this phenomenal subjective experience. To the software or the computer that is learning, there is not, this subjective character of what it feels like to experience something is not there. So coming back to the question, yes, something can be an instance of learning like the software with the chess game example, without any associated phenomenal aspect. So the software, so someone, the computer, or something, can learn without having this, without the fact that this learning is associated with a phenomenal character. Okay? So given that this can happen, the mental state of learning is primarily a psychological one. Primarily, okay? There can be phenomenal aspects to it, but primarily is a psychological one. Okay? Or believing, same thing. To believe something like a proposition B, we can describe it roughly as being in a mental state that causes a certain behavior. Okay, that would be appropriate if B were true. Okay, for instance, my belief that tonight it's gonna rain will cause the behavior to like get my umbrella and so on and so forth and so forth. Okay, can we have instances of believing that are unaccompanied by this phenomenal character? Yes, arguably yes. Again, if we look at the case of computers, sometimes it makes sense to say things like, oh, my laptop believes that, I don't know, there is no, that the battery is dying, okay? Well, there is a sense according to which the laptop believes it, okay? Because the laptop kind of knows, you know, the charge of the status of the battery. So, according to at least certain descriptions, the mental state of the laptop believing that the battery is dying, notice that it can generate behavior that would be appropriate if P were true. For instance, I don't know, the laptop will automatically start to, you know, consume less energy if the battery is dying, something like that. So it generates some sort of behavior. And again, this is arguably, I don't know, we didn't check the mental states of our laptops, but at least in principle, this experience of believing can be unaccompanied, not accompanied by phenomenal experiences, what it feels like to believe something. So it is that every time there is a phenomenal aspect, there is always also a corresponding psychological aspect. If my mind is having a phenomenal conscious experience of seeing blueness, well, it is accompanied by the psychological mental state of perceiving blue. But the converse does not always hold. We can have psychological experiences, like the cases that we have just seen with learning, for instance, that are not accompanied by the corresponding phenomenal aspects. A further difficulty before we move to the last point is that whereas we have plenty of vocabulary to talk about the psychological aspects of the mind, okay, like learning and believing, or introspection, or awareness, and so on, we don't have a vocabulary to describe the phenomenal aspects of our mental lives. And think about this example. Suppose that you have a friend that has never experienced the green color. Okay? For some weird reason, this person has never seen something green. Okay? Now imagine that someone asks you to explain to this person, to this friend of yours, what it feels like to look at something green. Okay? I dare you, but I take it that it's almost impossible to explain to someone, again, who has never experienced the green color, to explain what it feels like. Okay? Like, where could you start? It's like, I don't know, you would say things like, well, you know, it's like seeing green and similar to seeing blue, but actually it's different. Or I don't know, it's similar to seeing yellow, but it's not really the same thing. I don't know, I mean, I would have no idea how I could explain to someone what it feels like to feel greenness. I kind of know what it is because I experience it myself, but I don't know how to put it into words. We lack a vocabulary to talk about the phenomenal aspects of our mind. And this example should show it, okay? Or again, think about if you wanted to explain to someone what it feels like to be happy. Typically you might say things like, oh, you know, when I'm happy, I do certain things, I don't know, I jump in my room, or I don't know, I call my friends and I'm all excited and I talk to them, stuff like that. But notice that you will end up explaining, mentioning things that you do, right, when you're happy. And that's again the psychological aspects of happiness. What happiness is caused by and what happiness causes. But what it feels like to be happy, we know it, hopefully, but we lack words to explain this phenomenal aspect of happiness. Okay? Now, finally, to the main, now that we have this on board, this distinction between phenomenal aspects, what it feels like to experience something, and the psychological aspects, what our minds do, we can finally get to this famous distinction between the easy mind-body problem and the hard mind-body problem, which is basically, one of the things David Chalmers is most famous for. It was the first person making this distinction that now is traditional in the field between the easy mind-body problem or the easy problem of consciousness and the hard problem of consciousness. Now, traditionally, throughout the history of philosophy, the mind-body problem is just the problem of how to reconcile our body, our physical body, or our brain, we could say, with the mind. Okay? And if you remember your Descartes, that's one of the things he's concerned with. Like, why is it the case that, you know, my physical body or my brain generates this mental, seemingly immaterial life? Okay? Why is it the case that some stuff that I can touch if I want to, if I open a skull, and like generates this mental life? Okay? So that's traditionally the mind-body problem. There are many, of course, possible ways to answer it. But what Chalmers does in this book is trying to add, like, let's say, a layer to this traditional mind-body problem. And it is that, whereas it is that, so we saw this distinction between the psychological and the phenomenal. The idea is that, at least according to him, is that when we want to explain, when we want to find an explanation for the psychological aspects of the mind, that's the easy problem. Why is it easy? Because thanks to current science, we have some answers. Maybe these answers are incomplete, maybe they will require further years of investigation, but in principle it is doable, okay? We can explain, maybe just to a certain extent, how a system, like a mental system, can do stuff, okay? If the problem is explaining how things are done, okay, or what causes certain things, or what is caused by a mental state, we have a pretty good knowledge of how this can be achieved. We can explain, for instance, how a system learns, okay? Don't ask me because I don't know, but we have, for instance, machine learning that it was extremely illuminating in explaining how a system can learn and how this can be an analogy of how our mind works when it comes to learning. But notice that, again, and this is the main point, this has to do with the so-called psychological aspects. We explain the mind in terms of what causes a certain mental state and what is caused by this mental state. Now, the point is that explaining these doings, these causal networks, let's say, that the mind is part of, is the easy problem. Again, we shouldn't, not easy because it's super easy, it can be difficult in practice, but there is no metaphysical, there there is no, let's say, metaphysical mystery to it. We can tell a story about like a system is able to interact with some external stimulation and react accordingly. Okay? Like, for instance, how could a physical system be the sort of thing that learns and remembers? Well, I don't know. Think about, for instance, how our computers store information. I don't know. I have no clue, but we know that someone out there knows how we can store information in a physical system. So we can say that, for instance, a computer remembers. Or we can now explain at least certain aspects of learning with machine learning and so on. So, easy problem of the easy mind-body problem, because it is at least in principle easy. We have a clear research agenda. We know what to do to tackle this problem. Okay? We just need to figure out models of how things work and how they causally interact with each other. Now, obviously, as you might have guessed, the hard part of the mind-body problem, the second part, does not have to do with the psychological aspects of the mind, but with the phenomenal aspects of the mind, right? So we encounter, when we tackle the hard mind-body problem, how can a physical system like our brain give rise to conscious experience, understood in this phenomenal sense? Okay, the fact that it feels like what it feels like to have certain experiences. Or questions such as why, for instance, certain functions, like the fact that perception, for instance, the perception of green, why are they accompanied by certain phenomenal experiences? Why the fact that, again, when I see the blue color, this comes with a certain phenomenal character to it, okay? We can tell a causal story that, again, perceiving a blue object causes certain events in my brain, and this in turn, these events causes, for instance, a behavior and so on. We are there or we can get there. But why this perception is accompanied by this subjective experience, by this particular character phenomenal character of seeing blue, that's part of the hard problem of consciousness. Chalmers argues that even to the best of our science, current science, we can, again, tackle quite well, and we are doing like really impressive things in addressing the easy problem of consciousness, but still it is nowadays a mystery still how we can explain the phenomenal aspects, why having a consciousness feels the way it feels, okay? And not only we don't have a solution, it's even difficult, he argues, to think about what could be a solution, or what could be a theory that explains that. In the second part of the book, he tries to provide a theory, and there are other alternatives in the market, but in the literature, but the idea is that that's something mysterious. Also think about this question, why when I have a blue experience, it is exactly that particular experience and not another one. So basically the distinction is between the easy and the hard mind-body problem, or the problem of consciousness. The easy one is to explain how our mind works, how it does what it does, what causes certain mental states, and what is caused by these mental states. Again, it's easy in the sense that we know what to do. A certain progress has been made, and arguably, in the next decades, the progress will continue. Whereas with the hard problem is to explain this phenomenal character that we are aware of in terms of subjective experience, because we all perceive that our conscious experience with the world, or with our introspections, come with a certain particular flavor. But what explains that, why again, why the experiences that we have are accompanied by this phenomenal character. Chalmers says that this second problem is, again, the hard part. It still remains a mystery, it still remains a big challenge, and it's also, I mean, probably the most interesting part of the mind-conscious, of the mind-body problem. Why? How is it the case that something physical generates the particular experiences that we have? Just, okay, we'll try to finish in 5 minutes so that I leave some room if there is any question. So, we said that we were going to use the term consciousness. In principle, we should always specify whether we're talking about psychological or phenomenal consciousness, okay? And we will see that in the debate, there is a lot of confusion because, again, people might tend to use these terms interchangeably, even though they refer to different things. Couple of examples. Consciousness is often confused with being awake. So, but what does it mean to be awake? Well, arguably can be defined as a function, as the ability to process information from the external world, okay? When I'm asleep, I typically do not, or I process only partly the information from the external world and respond accordingly, possibly in a rational way. But awakeness, in this sense, is a function, something that my mind might do, the fact that it processes information and so on. So it's a psychological property, okay? Consciousness is sometimes confused with introspection. With the fact that, for instance, I can look inside myself and look, for instance, at my beliefs, my knowledge, my feelings, desires, and so on. But introspection is the ability, can be defined in other ways, but it's just an ability, a function to be able to access our own internal states. Okay, I have an internal state of having a desire. If I'm able to introspect, I can access this information. Again, this is a function. It's so in the terminology used by Chalmers, it's one of the psychological properties. Another one is reportability, the fact that I'm able to report my mental states by communicating, for instance. This is again a psychological property. Notice though that, and there are others that probably we will see in the other lecture, in the next lecture. But notice that when we talk about reportability, the fact that I can report my own internal states sometimes, the fact that I can introspect my own internal desires, thoughts, and so on. This is again a function, something that my mind can do, okay? Or again, awakeness, the fact that I can process external information has to do with the fact of something that my mind can do. What is left out by these characterizations of consciousness is again this phenomenal aspect, what it feels like, for instance, to have a certain desire, what it feels like to have a certain perception, these subjective phenomenal characters of our mental experience, which again are different from the functions that our minds can perform. So, to sum up, and we will continue from here next time, the main point again is the distinction between the psychological and the phenomenal aspects, and the fact that then the psychological aspects give rise to the easy problem of consciousness or the easy mind-body problem, whereas the phenomenal aspects of our mental lives are what constitute, trying to explain why we have certain experiences and they have that certain character, constitutes the hard problem of consciousness or the hard mind-body problem. So I think that that's it for now, and so thank you, and yeah, just I will ask you if there is any question. Yeah, I see one hand.
Name's Harley. First of all, one of the first things you said is that we can't interact with others or our own conscious state. How so? We have a few ways to do that. First of ones being, for example, chemical. Drugs, alcohol can influence our phenomenal perception of the world easily. And we know how they work. Take cocaine, for example. It releases certain enzymes that that enhance the dopamine secretion that makes us act more energetic and appreciative of the world, so to say.
Okay. Yeah. Maybe. I wasn't clear. Yeah. I mean, what you say is perfectly right. When I say that we cannot access each other's, for instance, the conscious experience of someone else. I have no way. By introspection, I can access my own conscious experience. I cannot access yours. I simply meant that I have no way to have access to your conscious experience or the conscious experience of anyone else.
Okay, counterpoint to that. Surgical operations. We have, for example, a patient sick with bipolar disease in late stage. He has a certain part of the brain that seems more white, and that produces this mood changes and so on. Cutting out that part gives us the ability to influence others' mental state to give it a more comfortable existence, so to speak.
We know all sorts of ways to influence mental states through physical means, can be drugs or any sort of experiences or whatever. Yeah, we can definitely influence the mental state of other people, and in a sense we do it all the time. But yeah, coming back to my point, and my point was just that we do not have a direct access to the conscious experience of other people. They can, other people can tell us about how they feel, for instance. I don't know, your friend can tell you, oh, today, I'm depressed or I'm happy and so on. They can tell you things about their conscious experience, but it's always indirect. Like we never have a direct access to what it feels like to them.
Well, what do you mean exactly then by direct? I just gave you a few examples of how we can directly influence through chemical or surgical means.
I grant you that you can influence it. I totally grant you that you can influence the conscious experience of other people. I totally agree. But that doesn't mean we can have direct experience of what it feels for them. I don't know, to be happy, to be depressed, to be excited, and so on.
Alright, coming to our next question. You gave a clear distinction between the phenomenal and psychological experience of the world. Why do you believe that the subjective, phenomenal perspective of the world cannot be a natural reaction of the psychological one?
Yeah, that's actually definitely a possible interpretation, and one could say that, look, maybe it's just the phenomenal aspects are just caused, as you said, by the psychological aspects. We will see that Chalmers denies that, and he will have an argument to deny that, and which we'll talk about it. We'll talk about it in the next lecture. But it's definitely a way to go. Someone may say, no, look, all there is to the mind is just the psychological aspects, and the phenomenal aspects are just caused by it. It's actually one of the possible positions in the debate. Chalmers does not believe in that, and we will see again next time arguments for this claim, but yeah, it's definitely like a possibility. Is there any other comment or question? Do you have other questions?
I see people are starting to sigh, so I'll just do another one and finish that. So, what was it?
So maybe there's another
question.
I wanted to say that there is super simple, not definition, but explanation of the first and second question. You cannot feel You cannot feel something that another person feels. You can access this state.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I agree. Again, we have ways to communicate with each other, obviously, or I can infer how a person feels by looking at their behavior, for instance. But this again, the point was, yeah, as you said, we don't have this access to like the feelings and thoughts of this person. Okay, we only have like non-direct ways to access to it through, again, for instance, looking at the behavior or looking at what this person says and so on and so forth. That was just this idea. Okay, any other? Okay, so I think that's it for today. Thank you again, and I'll see you in 2 days. Thank you.